7, 6, 5. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Starboard Portal. My name is Brittany Manning. Today we have Tim Herzog talking to us about mental health and performance for sailing. This talk is going to help parents, coaches, program directors, and mature sailors learn about what signs to look for when spotting distress. It'll also help answer the questions, am I seeing mental health issues or is this normal performance anxiety? How well is my sailor coping with COVID-19 anxiety or loss? And how can they maximize training while our options are limited? Who do I refer my sailor to and when? What kinds of professionals would be the best fit? How do I refer my sailor without making them feel crazy? And through this conversation, Dr. Tim Herzog will answer these questions and help take the stigma and enigma out of mental health and performance. There will also be an explanation of reaching ahead programs and time for a Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Tim, and he's going to tell you more about what you're going to hear from him today.
All right, thanks, Brittany. Glad to be here. Yeah, Brittany gave a nice overview of what I'm going to be talking about. Let me quickly introduce myself a little bit further. So as you can see, I have a few letters after my name. My EDD is my doctorate. I also have a couple master's degrees. And they're in counseling psychology and clinical psychology. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Virginia, and I'm also a licensed counselor in the states of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Montana, where I moved back east from 6 years ago. I'm a certified mental performance consultant through the Association of Applied Sports Psychology. And I am board certified in biofeedback, and I will talk a little bit about what biofeedback is later in the talk. So I'm in private practice in Annapolis, Maryland, and my practice is called Reaching Ahead. And I wear two hats. Sometimes I'm wearing my performance coach hat, and sometimes I'm wearing my therapist hat. And I try to make a distinction between the two services, although of course there's a big gray area in the middle. And that's going to be a lot of the focus of this talk today is that, that continuum. I come at this as a sailor myself too. So I sailed competitively for many years. I sailed in college at St. Mary's, go Seahawks. And then I coached for a number of years too, both junior sailing at many different clubs, and was assistant coach at Kings Point, the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, and was head coach for a brief stint at Boston College, where we actually, it was the beginning of a legacy, and we had, 4 All-Americans on that roster that year and got 5th at nationals. So I like combining my many years of schooling and supervised work with my practical knowledge from having been a coach myself. Feel free along the way to interrupt me with questions. If they're relevant, we'll dive right in, and Brittany will give me a prompt. And if they can wait, then we'll approach them at the end. So here we go. When I am talking about whether it be mental health or mental performance, I am talking about it through this lens most often, right? While we might want to be in control of all of human experience and performance, the way I see it, we really have control over what we do, our behaviors. And while we might want to have control over our thought processes and the experiences we feel in our bodies, the way I think about it, we've got influence over it. Sometimes we've got control, and sometimes we're along for the ride. And then when it comes to emotional experiences, at least in the moment, I tend to think that the best we can do is be mindful of and accept whatever those experiences are. And just as an example, right? Plenty of well-meaning coaches or parents, or sometimes we even do it to ourselves, might say, don't be frustrated or don't be anxious. And with that, you experience it that much more. Whereas if we can notice whatever the experience is and let it come and let it go, then it doesn't have to take as much of a grip. You can see within each of these categories of human experience, right, there are 3 mental performance skills that I tend to focus on with my athletes and other kinds of performers. And sometimes when I'm doing mental health stuff too. So knowing your values, smart goal setting. So you're not just talking about goals, but you're actually achieving them. Understanding your motivation, self-talk habits, mental imagery. So seeing in your mind's eye what it is that you want to do before you go do it, whether it's, kind of aerial view on the race course or much closer perspective. Mindful attention. So developing routines to guide your attention to where you want it to go on purpose. And then, I tend to work with people also on self-attunement, being aware of what's going on emotionally, being able to label it so it can come and go without necessarily taking a grip. Anxiety tolerance in this day and age, and we'll talk about this a bunch today. And by the way, I will take the full hour, I think, to chat, and then we can go another 15 minutes or so beyond that for Q&A. But anxiety tolerance, in this day and age, I think folks really don't want to experience anxiety themselves. They don't want their kids to experience it. And yet, when we try to not experience it, we experience it that much more. And so I often work with people on actually being in touch with it and taking the catastrophe out of it. I work with folks on communication, often finding a nice balance between being direct with your needs, while also looking out for the other person's needs as well, and finding a nice middle ground. And I work with folks on energy management from 2 perspectives, right? Making sure that we're taking care of lifestyle stuff like sleep, and then also taking care of maximizing energy in the moment, given whatever's already in the tank. Work with people on anxiety reduction techniques, coming at it from a place of, okay, now that I've spent some time on anxiety tolerance, I'm going to turn this down a notch because I can, as opposed to because I desperately have to. And channeling emotions. So, sometimes those emotions do stick around, even if they are negative. And so we can actually end up using them as our secret weapon rather than having them hold us back. So starting to think about continuums, we can think about, at one end of the continuum, there's psychotherapy. Overlapping with that is counseling, right? And so both are geared towards addressing problems, whether it's everyday kinds of problems, performance problems, or deeper problems. Now in the middle territory, we've got mental performance or stress management, right? And so again, you see that there's some overlaps. With this, that's really the emphasis on skills, just like the skills that I was laying out here, right? And I would say also sometimes overcoming performance barriers as well too. And so mental performance, I think, is a little bit more broad than just mental skills training. And then certainly coaches and trainers, folks who are working with people on developing technical skills or physical skills, they sometimes venture into this territory as well. For instance, getting an athlete to engage in imagery of something that they want to go do on the race course. So, with that, I think it's important just to simply be aware of, what's my lane and when do I maybe want to get other people's help on board and when do I want to work in partnership with other people. This is looking at the mental health performance continuum, and it's published actually in a document that I'd recommend checking out if you're interested. NCAA mental health best practices. There's a guide. If you Google it, it will pop right up. But we see, at one end of the continuum, debilitating or dangerous mental disturbance. On the other end of the continuum, we've got balanced living and excellent psychological functioning, finding significance, meaning, and success in many life domains, seeking optimal performance and experience. And of course, there's a lot in between. And we can see how this kind of meshes with the continuum we were just looking at, right? And so in the middle, we've got normal psychological functioning, a little stressed, unbalanced, and occasional dips in functioning. I think that's most of us, right? I think we all strive to be, further right of that and better. Very few symptoms, involved in a wide range of activities, effective socially and vocationally, desiring to improve further in specific areas of life, may still be hindered by certain life problems. That's actually probably most of us. Very few of us are problem free. Nonetheless, we do not want to minimize what could be a mental health problem, right? If something is really kind of edging on the left side of that continuum, we want to do something about it. And even if somebody is functioning quite highly, as many top athletes do, it doesn't mean that they are free of pathology. And I think this video I'm about to show you is a really good example of that.
I wanted to show that I was tough and that I had everything under control. I felt more anxiety, and what I did was I just pushed it down. Then it spiraled into the bulimia. You think that maybe if you're a little bit lighter in the water, you'll be a little bit faster. I wasn't sleeping at all. You can hide it very, very well. I think that's the scary part with mental health.
When something bad happens, I turn to like a destructive mindset.
I was like jittery. I've never been jittery before. I've never been like nauseous.
I felt very isolated, like I was on an island by myself.
I'd almost make myself feel sick some days.
It felt like my heart was
almost like walls closing in on me.
So again, really high functioning people, and at the same time, as they're striving to function highly, striving to win championships or to be their best, mental health can take a toll in the process. And we want to do what we can to support athletes, sailors, and otherwise along the way. Again, I made reference to the mental health best practices guide. I encourage you to check it out, especially for college coaches out there, but high school coaches and others may, including program directors, you may, even if you don't emulate completely what the NCAA is doing, it may give you some ideas regarding best practices. And that's a way in which, you could elicit my help along the way too. And I can help you figure out what might be best practices within your own unique setting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health diagnoses, both general population, but then also in elite athletes. So about 1 in 5 adults, or 18.5%, experience some type of mental illness in a given year. And about 1 in 5 youths aged 13 to 18, or 21.4%, experience mental illness in their lifetime. So, these conditions can include anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, bipolar disorders, disordered eating, substance abuse, adjustment disorders, and more. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about anxiety and depression, and a little bit about adjustment disorders, and certainly, consider me a resource out in the world if you want to dive into anything else later on. So some generic and sport risk factors for elite athletes, and I say generic because this is the kind of thing that could affect anybody. Or some risk factors might be completely independent of being an athlete. They can include having a severe injury, right? If somebody is taken out of the game, or if pain is a thing for them, or both. If they experience multiple surgeries, if they have, a hit on their sport performance, whether it be because of injury or anxiety or just cause, unexplainable reasons. And if they show maladaptive perfectionism, right? A little bit of perfectionism might help an athlete, but it can take its toll if it's truly obsessive. And at the same time, it's important to consider, right, that sport participation may actually protect mental health too. The connections we make in sport, the exercise, and the impact on our neurotransmitters can really have a positive impact. In fact, there's been some research that shows that exercise is at least as good as antidepressant, which is not to say that one should just drop their antidepressants and exercise instead. Obviously work with your psychiatrist, but it's something to keep in mind. Again, there might not be any association between being an elite athlete and experiencing mental health issues. Folks can experience losses. There can be a slew of reasons behind what impacts mental health, and sometimes it's unexplainable. We'll get into more of the factors along the way here. So prevalence in elite athletes. This is from a recent article that the IOC put out, a consensus piece that they put together. Male elite athletes from team sports, ranged from 5 to 45% for anxiety and depression. Female elite athletes also exhibited mental health disorders, especially eating disorders. Prospective studies have shown that mental health disorders occur in 5 to 35% of elite athletes over a follow-up period of about 12 months. And among collegiate athletes, the prevalence of mental health disorders ranges from 10 to 25% for depression and eating disorders. And so you see these big ranges, right? Because one study will show one thing, and then another study shows something else. So the quote unquote truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. One really important factor to consider in all of this, right? It's a little bit chicken or the egg. Sleep, right? Sleep can be impacted by mental health. Likewise, mental health can impact sleep. Insufficient sleep is defined as having less than 7 hours of sleep for a healthy adult. Ideally, you're getting a bunch more than that, depending on who you are, but most people need at least 7 to 8. Adolescents and younger adults need 9 to 10 hours. And it's interesting that over half of collegiate athletes in the US report regularly getting insufficient sleep. Think about the toll that takes on mental health, right? And so we instantly have a risk factor in half of that population right there. Also noteworthy that 50% report less than 7 hours of sleep per night in a season, and 79% report 8 hours or less. And when you think about, working to achieve at that top level too, there's been some research that actually shows that a little bit of sleep extension, like getting 8 to 9 hours of sleep, really can be your ticket to optimizing performance. At times, maybe even getting that 9 to 10. So switching gears and talking about some common mental health diagnoses. Depression obviously is something that pops up on all of our radars. It can be absolutely debilitating, but it can also exist on a continuum, right? And when we're talking about a diagnosis of depression, we're talking about either for a 2-week period, depressed mood, or loss of interest or pleasure in things that you normally found appealing. Right. And then beyond that, we're looking at 5 or more symptoms overall, right? Including significant weight loss, could be a gain or a loss. We're talking about slowing down of thought or physical movement. Somebody might very observably be kind of dragging their way through the day. You think of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, thanks for noticing. It could be very much like that. Fatigue often comes with depression. People can feel like there is a giant weight on them, which makes it that much harder to break the chain, right? Because part of getting on a better track is doing things like having exercise and having routines, having activities where you're engaging with other people. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, diminished ability to think clearly, or indecisiveness, and recurrent thoughts of death, and that can include recurrent suicidal ideation, thoughts of suicide. And that doesn't necessarily mean having a specific plan or having a suicide attempt, but one can have thoughts, and that is a warning sign. Now, talking about depression in elite athletes, again, talk about a wide range, right? Here, the studies show between 4 to 68%. Now, I think elite athletes are really a newer group that has undergone extensive study. Looking more closely at the research, prevalence of depressive symptoms really seems to be comparable when we're looking at elite athletes and general population. Pretty similar. Risk factors, genetics, right? If you have depression in your family or other mental health issues or substance abuse issues, environment, right? So if somebody lacks support, and that might not be apparent, right? Like they may have support in their life, but maybe not the kind of support that they want, or maybe they don't feel as connected with people as they would like to. Injury, I mentioned that already, right? That can be a significant risk factor with athletes. Competitive failures, right? If somebody has been striving towards something and then a big loss occurs. And that's something to be wary of right now, as COVID-19 has reared its ugly head and has prevented people from having their shot at what they've been working hard towards. Whether it's college teams, high school teams, or individual pursuits right now, sailing along with the rest of the world has been shut down. Retirement from sport, could be the end of somebody's college career, or maybe it's the end of their high school career and they are not looking to sail in college. I think one thing that's wonderful about the sport of sailing is that if we want it to be, it's very much a lifelong sport. And so hopefully that can be a protective factor there. That would be a wonderful thing to research at some point. Pain, obviously, if you're experiencing physical discomfort, not only can it mess with sleep, but your sense of quality of life. Concussion, TBIs and whatnot can certainly have an impact on you, and it's often viewed as kind of the invisible injury, and that can be hard too. People don't necessarily know that somebody with a concussion is suffering. And after retirement, people experience less physical activity, or they can experience less physical activity. And so hopefully, even if you're sailing career ends for whatever reason, if you make a point of continuing to get time in the outdoors and physical activity, that can help your cause. If you look at, and unfortunately we don't have stats specifically on sailing, but more and more college sailing has really morphed since I was a college coach 20 something years ago. It's really morphed into being much more like other sports. In fact, I was just out in Park City with a whole bunch of college coaches in January. And it's really neat to hear how much more professional, all of it has become, whether it is the coaches providing the experience for college sailors, or, the manner in which college sailors are pursuing their discipline. Anyways, that was a meaningful tangent. Looking at the prevalence of depressive symptoms by sport and gender, interesting to look at the stats. Women exceed men in all the categories. However, I would take that with a grain of salt. I think you look at men's sport culture, and unfortunately, I think we're still battling stigma. So even if somebody is struggling, they might not necessarily let on. And I think we can see some, even if maybe these stats should be more comparable from team to team, like is soccer really that much different than lacrosse? I don't know. But living here in Maryland, I know that there's a certain bit of bravado, whether we're talking about men's lacrosse or women's lacrosse, and maybe more so than other sports. Important to consider that, if things appear to be hunky-dory, they're not necessarily hunky-dory. And I think especially in this era of social media, where, people work, especially young people, really work to create the image that they want. That image might look picture perfect, but it might very well be far from. So here's a video clip about Madison Holleran, and I think it speaks to the importance. She was an athlete at UPenn who, in her freshman year, committed suicide, actually tragically running off the top of a building. And for the most part, people didn't see it coming, although within this video, they identify what in retrospect should have been recognized as warning signs.
Instead of being the school of her dreams, it became the backdrop for her struggles. Running, school, friendship, nothing came as easily as it once had.
In college, everything's just turned up one notch. Like in high school, when you're trying to balance athletics, social, and school, it's very possible. It's difficult, but it's possible.
She wasn't feeling like she was achieving, I think, at her perfectionist level that she had become accustomed to.
And she couldn't make her real world look as perfect as the images she posted online.
There's the holes that you don't see. There's the hardships. There's the times when she was unsure, when she missed home. And that's kind of what people aren't seeing.
Madison felt off balance. She thought running took up too much time, and she considered quitting.
It was more like it was a time commitment, and it was taking away from other aspects of her life that she could have focused on more. Just like, I want a social life, and like track is really putting a burden on that.
Based on the pictures Madison was seeing online, her friends seemed to have found that balance, seemed to be enjoying college. Of course, when her friends looked at her pictures, they thought the same.
Often, like, she was trying to capture the beauty, and I think often when she did it, it was like a beautiful situation, but she like wanted to hold it forever and like remember it as that.
She could enjoy those small moments, but then she took the bad ones really, really hard.
When Madison went home over the holidays, she didn't want to admit she was unhappy, but she didn't have to say anything. Her family could tell.
When Madison came home, I didn't feel like she was really any happier. The one thing that she said that to this day still sticks out in my mind is, this isn't normal. It is not normal to feel this way.
We were all hanging out in like the living room. My brother said to her, he's like, you don't laugh anymore. Like, you just never laugh. And Madison was like, I know.
There was nothing in her face. Like, there was no, Madison like wasn't there. She didn't smile, which doesn't seem like it would be a weird thing, but for Madison it was. Like, to see her in a room for 10, 15 minutes and her not smile once, I mean, that was weird.
When I looked at her, she looked white, she looked depressed, and I said, Madison, I think you look depressed. And she was very quiet and said, Dad, all I want to do was go to sleep.
How much for you do you think it was setting in the space of college, and how much was it mental health?
Honestly, I think it was more of a mental health issue.
Is there any history of depression on your side of the on either side of the family?
Yes, there is.
So just a heartbreaking story.
Instead of being
you know, and every time I watch that video, it actually triggers me a little bit. You just can't help but feel for that family. You know, thinking about, so on the one hand, you know, what happened with Madison Halloran was a quote unquote freak incident. But, you know, so it's statistically, you know, it's not likely, but even one is too many, you know, and we want to do everything we can to make sure that people are happy, healthy, and that they live long, fulfilling lives, you know. It's serious stuff. You know, 7.3% of all college athlete deaths were attributed to suicide. Overall, the rate of suicide, you know, it's only, you know, about 1 in 100,000. Mean age is 20 years old. Football players are actually at greater risk than other groups. You know, risk factors can include childhood trauma, anxiety, agitation, aggression, impulsivity, hopelessness, interpersonal conflict, drugs and alcohol. You know, and obviously you combine drugs and alcohol with impulsivity, and that can be a bad recipe. Illness and injury, sleep disturbance. You know, people often make really bad decisions at 3 in the morning when, you know, their mind is not operating at optimal capacity. And then if somebody has had prior attempts also, that clearly is a red flag. Other symptoms of concern, you know, if we're just talking about mental health more globally, not just depression, overuse injuries, you know, working too hard at your sport, unresolved injuries, or continually being injured. I mentioned drug or alcohol abuse, gambling issues, risky behaviors, you know, that could include anything and everything from sex to, you know, driving a car crazy or what have you. Sudden emotional changes, problems concentrating, focusing, or remembering, complaints of fatigue, illness, or being injured that prevent participation, irritability or anger, irresponsibility, lying, legal problems, fighting, difficulty with authority, feeling out of control, gastrointestinal complaints, headaches. You know, oftentimes if somebody is not able to articulate what's going on with them psychologically, emotionally, it can manifest itself physically. And then unexplained wounds or deliberate self-harm. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about another common mental health diagnosis, generalized anxiety disorder. Number one criteria here is excessive anxiety and worry. Apprehensive expectation occurring more days than not for at least 6 months about a number of events or activities such as work or school performance. Now, keep in mind, as I lay this out, right, we want to keep the continuum in mind, right? So even if somebody maybe doesn't meet full criteria for GAD or generalized anxiety disorder, They may fit criteria for another anxiety disorder. Sometimes we call it anxiety disorder NOS, or not otherwise specified. Or, even if somebody doesn't necessarily check the boxes to have an anxiety disorder, anybody and everybody can benefit from some coaching or counseling in improving on this. Another thing with GAD is that the person finds it difficult to control the worry. The anxiety or worry are associated with 3 or more of the following 6 symptoms. The DSM, the book that is used as the gold standard for diagnoses, they're all about checking their boxes. It's a model that was put together by psychiatrists, MDs, as opposed to psychologists. And I think that's reflected a little bit in how we see the criteria laid out. Anyhow, restlessness or feeling keyed up on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbance, difficulty falling or staying asleep, or restless, unsatisfying sleep. When you think about the stressors that college athletes face, it makes sense in some respects that they might be prone, on the one hand, whether it's college sailing or other sports might be a preventative factor, but it could also present a risk factor when athletes feel overwhelmed with the amount of demands that they're facing, particularly if you combine that with perfectionism. Here's an example of another college athlete, luckily, who took steps to improve her mental health, Victoria Garrick.
You have to be at a team lift at 6 a.m., but you're accidentally 1 minute late because you slept through your alarm. Your heart's pounding from sprinting to the gym, but nobody cares that it's because you were up until 2 a.m. studying for an exam that you still don't feel prepared for. You can feel the tension between you and your teammates who now have to run sprints tomorrow at 6 a.m. because you were 1 minute late. You start the lift, and your mind's just not in the right place, but it doesn't matter. You have to lift. And as soon as it's over, you scarf down breakfast on your way to 8 a.m. class, and you get there, and your hair's still wet because you didn't have time to dry it. The professor looks at you and says, "Where's the homework assignment?" But you forgot it. How could you forget it? You were supposed to be on top of everything, so you sit there and you worry about what else you might have forgot. And at noon, you get a 30-minute break, but it's not really a break because you use it to quickly make up an assignment you missed for last week's game. And soon, it's 12:10, and to you, 40 minutes does not feel like enough time to get on the court and be ready, even though it actually is. So you head over, and at 1, practice is starting. And you have to forget everything that happened in your day, because at practice, you have to perform. You can't not perform. There's someone better than you, someone competing with you, and someone in high school who just committed to be you. So forget the 0 on your assignment. Forget the test you're not prepared for. Forget the friends you haven't seen in weeks. Forget the argument you've been in with your parent. Play well, pass well, perform. And when it's finally over, you find yourself staring in the locker room mirror, trying not to cry. And you ask yourself, is this how I'm supposed to feel? My name is Victoria Garrick, and I play volleyball here at USC. I've been playing sports my whole life, but never quite like this. Now in high school, I didn't understand mental illness. And usually when people say mental illness, people tense up because talking about it is uncomfortable.
So, a great TED Talk. I would encourage you to check out her whole talk. The note she leaves on there, I think is really important. We need to be able to make it safe to talk about mental health, or to talk about how people are doing anywhere on the continuum. Often talking about this stuff without necessarily giving it the label of mental health, it can really make it easier for athletes to talk about. So, I realize, again, we have a range of an audience here, for those college sailing coaches out there who are working in partnership, hopefully, with your sports medicine teams, with your athletic trainers. This is a suggested screening, and I think it's valuable for any of us, really. If an athlete or whomever, endorses any one of these, it's reason to follow up. And ideally, screenings occur at the front end as people are entering their sport in the first place. So I'll let you read these rather than me just reading an entire slide again. And when you look at it in black and white, in some respects, it's kind of a no-brainer, but I think it's really good for us to think it through concretely, and to make sure that we're asking not just one of these questions, but all of them if they seem like they might be relevant. As you're working, again, for college coaches, with your athletic departments, it's important that you have your emergency action plan figured out, and so that's recognizing, what is an emergency mental health referral versus, what maybe could be handled with a warm handoff. And I often use that phrase, warm handoff. I think it's really ideal if you develop relationships with people like me, on campus or off campus, so that, if it seems like somebody could use a helping hand, and again, I would encourage erring on the side of caution, it becomes that much easier to be like, hey, let me introduce you to Dr. Tim. He's a cool dude. At least I like to think so. Or whomever, right? Dr. Smith at, University of Texas or wherever you might be, right? If you can actually walk them over and have them shake hands with this person, or if you have somebody regularly working with the team, even if it's just a performance coach who doesn't have a mental health background, assuming that they have done a good job themselves of creating those connections for themselves in the practice that they do. Warm handoffs are always ideal. And sometimes that can mean, making a phone call, even if you're not able to do it in the flesh. If you can make a phone call or have them make the phone call with you sitting right there, then that wheels are in motion, right? Referring again to that NCAA best practices guide, I thought this is a really valuable quote. Okay, coaches should learn about the importance of being attentive and empathic in their interactions with student athletes who are facing mental health challenges, while understanding that the role is not to manage the situation themselves. They should instead follow the specific referral processes outlined by their institution's mental health referral plan. So, I think the onus is on coaches a bit to, you got to do your homework to know what are your resources, and what is my institution's referral plan, and ideally actually get to know people yourself so you can make that warm handoff. But you don't have to be the counselor or therapist yourself. That's not your training. You can use good interpersonal skills. I'll keep providing tips through this talk. I would love to follow up with anybody. But ultimately, it's not on you. Okay. So here are some concrete tips, whether you are a coach, a parent, a program director, or a teammate, right? Start the conversation, rather than pretending something isn't up, talk, right? And model good communication, right? Make eye contact, follow their pace, listen without necessarily trying to fix it. I think that, even if somebody is already getting help, I think that can be a barrier to expressing what's going on sometimes with coaches, right? If one senses that a coach is instantly going to dive in to try to fix it for you rather than taking steps to empower you to go fix it for yourself, then that can come with feelings of stigma or shame. You want to validate the emotions that you're hearing. Use good reflective listening skills. Like, it sounds like you're really sad, or it sounds like you've been feeling really anxious. And oftentimes, while those reflective statements might sound like no-brainers, athletes actually end up, or anybody for that matter, end up really appreciating somebody being tuned in enough to use the word that captures how you're feeling, and to say it in a tentative manner where, if you get it wrong, they're able to go, well, it's not quite like that. It's more like this, So ask questions, including if you have any reason at all to worry about this, even if it's just an out there hunch, ask questions, including, have you thought about hurting yourself? You are much better erring on the side of caution than playing it too safe. And erring on the side of caution rather than playing it too safe. I mean, erring on the side of caution in that you'd rather ask the hard questions and have somebody go, no, not at all. Rather than, I guess, avoiding that discomfort, I should say. Seek resources or talk with sports medicine, right? Figure out what is appropriate in your setting and do it proactively. Help remove that stigma. In the process too, by making it an everyday kind of affair that, yeah, of course people are seeking counseling. We don't need to name whom necessarily. People can identify themselves if they want to, and it's fine if they don't. But in that process, we take away the shame and and we help them address self-talk in the process. And that's something that actually could help them not just in, a mental health sense, but also in terms of their sport, right? If you're able to stop beating yourself up when it comes to having a problem, hopefully you stop beating yourself up as much on the race course also. And with that, you're able to focus more on the task at hand. I think one really positive trend is the removing of stigma. I'm not going to play this whole video, but here's somebody who has become a great spokesperson for mental health in athletes.
It was October of 2014 that I lost all hope. I was one of the world's most successful athletes. 18 gold medals. The all-American dream come true. But I was lost. I hadn't left my room in 5 days.
So Michael Phelps, along with Kevin Love and other famous athletes, have really done a great job of starting to take the stigma that much more out of mental health for general population, and I think in particular for athletes. So switching gears once again, obviously the obstacle that we're all dealing with right now is COVID-19 and the disruptions, or as I was putting this together, I came up with what I thought I was coming up with a word, abruptions, right? Abrupt disruptions. I guess it's actually a real word. It means a separation, which actually kind of makes sense here too, because people have been ripped from their classmates, from their teammates, college sailing teams, from coaches, from meaningful relationships, and from the accomplishments that they were chasing after, or the development of skills. I think it's important to emphasize that, with all this, there is no one quote unquote right reaction. It's not uncommon for people to experience anger. It's not fair that this happened. Well, no, it's not fair, but anger can often be layered on top of other emotions because it gives us an illusion of control, right? Like if you think about like a 3-year-old, who is having a temper tantrum, right? it's often because you are not doing what they want you to do. And anger at any age can often function in that way, where you are trying to get somebody to behave or get the world to behave in a way that you want it to. And that illusion of control can theoretically feel better than powerlessness. But is it really? I think it's a temporary fix at best, because as you maybe take that anger out on your family or friends or whomever else, that just contributes to more problems, right? It certainly doesn't take care of things. Another concept to consider here, Kubler-Ross years ago, I think in the 1960s maybe, came up with her stages of grief. And much later, she acknowledged that maybe these don't happen just as, kind of linear stages, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's natural for somebody to be kind of bouncing around. If you picture kind of a spider web rather than a linear list of these reactions, there can be denial, this is not happening, I am still going to nationals, or whatever it might be. There can be anger, as I mentioned before. There can be bargaining. Well, if I just did this, or if this just happens, then I'll finally get to sail that championship. Depression, feeling overwhelmed, sad, or helpless, in line with some of what we were talking about before. Or acceptance, ultimately coming to terms with a new reality. And one can bounce between acceptance and where they were. And so, as we're experiencing our abruptions, here's how, well, I should say another, before I dive into some coping strategies, another common mental health diagnosis that might be relevant here is the diagnosis of adjustment disorder, which, I've sometimes heard called the common cold of mental health, right? It's something that a lot of us experience when things go wrong. And so in some respects, it can seem pretty darn normal. So if we're talking about, within 3 months of when it happened, and so we're all in that time frame now with the whole COVID-19 crisis and social distancing and being robbed of opportunities, these symptoms or behaviors are clinically significant, as evidenced by one or both of the following. So marked distress that may seem out of proportion, and significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, right? And because so many of us are robbed right now of occupational or educational functioning anyways, right? I think we're most likely to see this develop in social context more than anywhere. And the stress-related disturbance doesn't meet criteria for other mental health diagnoses, and it's not a matter of normal bereavement, right? It's not simply because somebody passed away, which isn't a simple matter at all, obviously. And it can be acute if it lasts less than 6 months, or it can be chronic. It can last longer. So proactively, and it can come with depressed mood, it can come with anxiety, or it can be mixed, or somebody can act out, disturbance of conduct. So we have all kinds of categories, right? Or it can be unspecified. So some coping strategies to deal with what's going on here proactively, seek and model the wise mind, right? And by this, what I mean is making room for both what's rational and emotional, right? So maybe it's like, it is not freaking fair that we don't get to sail college nationals. Or, it's not freaking fair that the Olympics isn't going to happen for another year. And I will keep taking whatever steps I can to be the best sailor I can, even if that's, doing my mental imagery at home, right? Notice I'm not using a but. I'm not negating the emotional. I'm making room for both the emotional and the rational, so there doesn't have to be an internal battle or a tug of war. There can be room for both. So if we can find that space for ourselves, if we can model it for those we love, that can go a long way. Know your motivation. You want to honor your emotions, maybe you need a week or a few weeks off in the aftermath of, being robbed that championship or what have you. And at the same time, sooner or later, it's time to form plan B or C or D, right? Maybe plan B already went down the tubes as governor put the state on lockdown or whatever it is, right? If you can find what were the most motivating parts of your sport and integrate that into your day-to-day now, into your plan D, at least life might be a little bit better, even if it's not perfect. So figure out what you're most driven by and weave that in. And for a lot of people, it might be social life. So make a point of staying in contact. Now we're at a point where, well, yeah, it was ridiculous that we were all doing this all the time, looking at our phones. Now that might be our lifeline to our old teammates or to the outside world and connections that we really need to maintain for our mental and emotional health. Control the controllables, right? Just like in your sport, you want to embrace the process. Good outcomes in sailing or any other sport, they're a byproduct of focusing on itty bitty pieces of the process now. So determine what important processes help you towards your next big goal, right? Whether that's something sport related, figuring out sail trim or weight placement, maybe by watching videos or mental imagery, or maybe it's life related, like networking, taking steps towards that job if you're graduating from college. And seek the kinds of support that you need and want, right? I mentioned that the stigma for counseling is fading, luckily. I think during this crisis, telehealth makes access easier than ever. I think it's important to remember too, that while hopefully whomever gets it right, whether it's your mom, your dad, your friend, hopefully they get it right in terms of knowing how to support you, but they might need guidance, right? And so it's important to express what you need or want. Maybe you need to say, I'm hoping you can simply listen. I'm not looking for pity. I'm not looking for you to fix it for me. And then somebody has their cues for, what to do next. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and stray away from mental health and talk about mental performance a little bit. When we're talking performance, performance coaching or therapy, right? We can think about it in two ways, right? We can think about okay, performance was trucking along and we want to help it reach the next level from baseline, or maybe performance took a hit for some reason and we want to bring it back. And so performance coaches can often be useful for either, but particularly for performance enhancement. I'm not, for the sake of time, I'm not going to play this video right now. I would encourage you to check it out. There's a show on HBO called The Shop, and Elena Deladon, a woman basketball player, it gives voice to the fact that she's met with a sports psychologist and it's done her a world of good as she's become more aware of what's happening between the ears. So, again, here's my model. And as you can see, there's 12 different mental skills that I tend to zoom in with people on. Since we're just talking about anxiety disorders, I'm going to talk about two mental skills that tie into both mental health and mental performance. Anxiety tolerance is the idea that, I think I said this at the beginning, we can take the catastrophe out of anxiety, right? And that doesn't mean white knuckling your way through the experience. It means actually being present with whatever it is, whether it's, the thoughts that are occurring between the ears or the sensations that you're experiencing in your body, whether it be cold hands or sweat or muscle tension. For instance, actually, anytime I'm engaging in public speaking, and even through these means, I feel my hands get cold. So I can feel that right now. And luckily, though, at the same time, I can feel that my hands are relatively dry. You know, sweaty palms can be another cue of anxiety, right? But if we manage to be with those symptoms rather than fight them, then they don't take as much of a hold. One way I often think about anxiety, I think about the monster in the closet, right? Like if you can recall when you were a kid, or maybe if you have kids yourself, whether they're munchkins, or you can think back to the, way back when, there's probably a time when there was a big bad monster in the closet, right? And, the solution at the time felt like cowering under the sheets, but as you cowered under the sheets, or he or she did, that monster grew bigger and grew big giant fangs and was nasty and horrible. And the more you cowered, the more power that monster got, right? Whereas if you got up out of bed and you walked over and you opened up that closet door, well, right before you open it, maybe it's more vicious than ever, but then the moment you open it, poof, right? You recognize, okay, I can cope with what's in there. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it was a mouse making a little noise. Anxiety in general often works that way, right? Where if we are able to take on the thing that makes us most anxious, right? If we can actually explore it on a deeper level, right? Then it loses its power. Where if we leave it vague, like, I don't know what I'm scared about. I know I have this upcoming regatta and I don't even want to think about it, right? If we leave it as a thing we don't want to think about, it gives it power. Whereas if we can dive into, what is the most intimidating piece of that, then we can get somewhere. The monster loses power. Maladaptive anxiety, we can think of it as being essentially an overestimation of the threat, right? And an underestimation of coping. So maybe, that big regatta is coming up, overestimation of threat. Well, I could perform really lousy. I could perform second half of the fleet. I could perform back of the fleet. And if that happened, there is no way I'd be able to deal. And so I'm often working with people on reducing that sense of threat and increasing the sense that I can deal if that happens. And part of how I often strive to do that, I thought I had this slide in closer proximity. I'll just say it right now. It's the drill down technique, right? If I can dig deeper and deeper, if I can ask, okay, well, if you did finish, towards the back of the fleet, what would be the worst thing about that? Well, I would suck. Well, would you really, or would it be a one-time performance, or could you be better in the future? Well, yeah. Okay, so what would be the worst thing about it? Well, I'd be ashamed. Okay, and what would be the worst thing about that? Well, that's it. I would feel so ashamed. I wouldn't want to show my face again. Okay, but could you show your face again? Yeah. Okay. So, have you dealt with shame before? Yeah. Okay. And you were able to survive that? Yeah, I didn't like it, but I survived it. Right. So now we bring the threat level down. And in the process too, if we talk about coping strategies, like some of the ones I'm laying out, then, that maladaptive anxiety can fade a bit. Right? There's some natural anxiety reduction that comes with that as we tolerate the anxiety. I love this quote from my colleague, Sean McCann, who's at the US Olympic Training Center. I once heard Sean say, you're better off saying I'm excited than saying I'm nervous, but you're better off saying I'm nervous if you actually are, right? It's much better to be aware of your feelings and address them. You can reframe them slightly, but you don't need to deny them and pretend that they're not there, right? I just think that's so poignant. It backfires if we pretend we're not anxious. Anxiety doesn't take as much of a grip if we actually tune in and let it come, let it go without forcing it. Okay. I often approach this via what I call the mind-body ABCs. Happy in follow-ups to work with people on the ABCs, but essentially, A stands for activating event, B stands for belief, and we can think about that in terms of, what's happening between the ears, whether it be in words or in pictures. And I think about it being like, if you're reading the funnies or the comics, the bubble that's above somebody's head, what would go in there in that moment, right? And it's a split second in time that we're trying to capture. And then consequences, right? So with that, we're looking at, well, what's the mood? Like happy, sad, glad, mad, or variations thereof. What's the experience in the body? I already made some reference to that. And if that B sticks, what's the behavior? And so, as I work with athletes on this, whether sailors or others, I'm often encouraging them to log these in 3 varieties, right? A good, a not so good, and a redo, right? So if we can try on a different thought as a redo, quote unquote redo, then we can figure out a thought that actually helps us cope better, that helps us bounce back, be present moment, and perform better. For the sake of time, I'll skip this video too. I'd encourage you to Google it, keywords, something along the lines of skier's first jump, or young skier's first jump. It is hilarious and right on target with what we're talking about. Love this quote: "Courage is doing what you're afraid to do. You cannot have courage unless you're scared." Eddie Rickenbacker, who I think was a World War II pilot, maybe World War I. In any case, I think it's important to remember that we're not looking to eradicate fear. We're looking to cope with it better. And I think eradicating it can sometimes backfire. So here's that drill down technique that I was talking about before. What's the worst thing that could happen? What would be the worst thing about that? And what would be the worst thing about that? And what are the chances of that? And if it actually happened, what would be the worst part? And so on. And I've, working with some people, I've had this come down to kind of life or death, kinds of like, yeah, well, the worst thing that could happen there is that I could die, with that ski jump, maybe I eat it and, really bad things happen from there. Okay. Sometimes people's worst fears, I used to do a lot of work with military. Sometimes they're pretty real life. And at the same time, we can figure out, how can you make sure that within the controllables, that you're doing the best you can in the face of that. In talking about anxiety, again, taking the catastrophe out, I often want to find the sweet spot, right? A little bit of anxiety, a little bit of stress is not such a bad thing. It helps us perform. If we're over here on the curve, maybe we're kind of bored, falling asleep. Over here, we're too amped up, we're too angry or anxious. And so somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot. And that's where we have a calm mind and an active body. I often map people's inverted U's that are unique to them. And I often talk about it with them according to what's happening in light air versus heavy air, for instance. Sometimes get even more specific than that. And then anxiety reduction skills. And I realize I do need to wrap up here soon and take questions. We've talked some about common stress responses, right? One way that I commonly work with people on stress responses is to use biofeedback. So tapping into the mind-body connection, where we can look at things like heart rate and look at how breathing, when we have nice rhythmic inhales and exhales, how heart rate then follows, right? Whereas we inhale, heart rate goes up. As we exhale, heart rate goes down. And with that, heart rate variability is maximized, which is actually a really good thing when that difference between the peak and the valley is bigger. When that happens, we tend to feel more mentally calm and physically alert. And here's some of how we measure it with what's called a photoplasmograph, or light sensor, and respiration or strain gauge. And here's some of the screens. The takeaway I want to give you on this front, so that we can get on to questions, to have HRV informed breathing, right? One, make sure that you develop good breathing architecture, right? So if you put a hand on your chest and a hand on your belly, again, I'm not going to do it right now for the sake of time, but you can make sure that your top hand is still while your bottom hand goes up and down with each inhale and exhale. Notice, you know, my top hand wasn't moving at all, only my bottom hand was. You want to have long exhales, you know, as you could see here, right? Heart rate goes down when we have a nice long exhale, when breathing is rhythmic. You want to start with about 4 seconds on your inhale, 6 seconds on your exhale. It's a much longer exhale than most people are used to. And I would encourage you to check out the breathing apps that are out there. The one I love most, it's called Cardia Deep Breathing. Look for the purple K. Be happy to do, you know, follow-up work with individuals or groups. Yeah, there's some simple biofeedback apps and gadgets out there. So ultimately what we're after, we're trying to lower the baseline level of stress and anxiety. We're trying to make it so that when stressors come along, that delta isn't as big, right? We don't get as stressed out. We're trying to make it so that stress and anxiety doesn't linger quite as long, and so that we're able to bring it down more sooner. Working on breathing a bunch, I thought this quote from a former client of mine was awesome. Your mind is in the fog, breathing makes it clear. It helps you focus on the immediate important tasks and lets superfluous thoughts go. It's been life-changing almost. That cracked me up. In my sailing, breathing, it's like laser focus. It gets rid of all the clutter. As you seek out referrals for mental health or mental performance, here are some of the credentials to look for. I've circled mine. I mentioned already the states that I'm licensed in. I'm newly licensed as a psychologist in Virginia. Obviously there's a lot there, but you know, come back to the video on Starboard Portal and check it out. In the past, I'll just say this real quick too. I did a year-long group at one point. I recently have been working on taking that basically 24 sessions of material and pulling out the best pieces so that somebody can do it as a self-paced online course. And with that, and you know, here's some of the course in the works now. It should be launched hopefully by next Friday, not this week, but the following week. But it'll be a self-paced course, and it's broken into nice little segments. So, you know, you're not necessarily committed to having to do any big chunk at a given time. And it will include worksheets as well. So with that, you know, and there's other approaches we can use too, whether it's groups, whether it's coach consultations, there's a lot we can do. So I encourage you to reach out. So I know I've been long-winded. Brittany, let's go ahead and take any questions.
Yeah, so if anybody has questions for Tim, feel free to fire away in the chat, and we've got a couple ready to go here. First, we want to know, you don't often hear about people outside elite levels of sport talking about using a sports psychologist. How can sports psychology be beneficial at levels of sport that are super competitive, yet may not be considered elite?
Yeah, great question. You know, I would say in my practice that most of my athletes are not necessarily elite athletes. You know, I work with people from, you know, it's rare that I go as young as 12 or 11, but sometimes I do. If in talking with a parent, it seems like it's a good fit. But, you know, oftentimes from 13 years old on up. And, you know, gosh, you think about the slew of mental skills we talked about in the beginning. I mean, not only do those skills help with performance, but they really help with life. You know, they can help you in academics. They can help you in any kind of performance arena or anytime you need to be self-regulating. And certainly when we're talking about potentially counseling, I wouldn't even let it be a potentially. Like if the thought crosses your mind, like give it a go. Yeah, you know, try not to let stigma be a barrier. Try not to let money be a barrier. Hopefully, if you need to, you can find somebody in network. I'm out of network, but for my clients in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Montana, at least I can help with the process of you getting reimbursed. So hopefully that helps.
Great. And then we've got another one here. Can you talk about mental imagery and how that can be beneficial while we're all stuck inside?
Yes. So another great question. Mental imagery is something that's near and dear to my heart too. My doctoral dissertation, I actually looked at using mental imagery combined with video with college sailors. And this is, back before GoPros were really a thing. And so we were duct taping little cameras inside dry bags on a snowboarding helmet. Anyways, mental imagery, like even if we aren't necessarily integrating it with video, if you see in your mind's eye what it is that you want to do, right? If you do repetitions up here, then by the time you are back out on the water, right? It's in some ways it will be like you've never missed a beat. There's loads of stories of Olympic divers or what have you, people who have been injured, who have not been able to practice, and then they do their mental practice and they perform that much better because of it. Ideally, you're able to have some physical practice combined with mental practice, and that double whammy can really help performance the most. But even if you're only able to do mental practice, that helps too. As you do mental practice, one last thing I'll say on it, integrate all the senses, right? Sight, sound, touch, feel, and I mean emotional feelings as well. It's like reading a good book. If you weave in all those kinds of details, it makes it that much more real. You can write it out. You can record it so that then you can listen to it, or you can construct it without any cues necessarily. And one last thing I'll say about it is that there's no wrong way to do it. Figure out what works for you and do it consistently. And I think this is really an optimal time to start experimenting with it. You've got some time on your hands.
And we've got a question from Hannah, and she wants to know what the best ways to promote mental health in smaller sailing programs would be.
Well, I mean, gosh, for starters, I'd love to do a webinar for you at some point, Hannah, or whomever else, or encourage people to check out this talk. I think if you can highlight professional athletes who have made it no big thing or less of a thing, like Michael Phelps, like Kevin Love, like Elena Deladon. I think that's huge. I think asking questions, creating a safe environment, where, not only are kids, not permitted to be mean to each other, but where, every day coach is boosting kids up, kids are boosting each other up, and we're able to talk about things like, oh, that was really frustrating. And back to Wise Mind, right? This is what I'm going to do next.
Great. And Julian's got a fantastic question that I think a lot of sailors probably struggle with. Hey, Tim, for example, after sailing a race that didn't go to plan, what's the best way to reset your mind before the next one?
Yeah, so I would take that back to the ABCs, right? Somewhere in here. Theoretically. So if you're logging your ABCs on a day-to-day basis, you can get better and better at noticing what it is that you're saying to yourself. If you're running around on autopilot where your brain is just spouting stuff and you don't even know that it's spouting it, right? Then you're experiencing some of this stuff, whether it's fear, hopelessness, butterflies, lethargy, moving slowly, right? You are likely experiencing that and experiencing the whirlwind of thoughts contributing to more of that for quite some time before you're even inclined to do something about it, at which point it may feel like an uphill battle to make anything different happen, right? But if we're tracking ABCs on a regular basis, then it becomes much easier to go, whoa, wait a second. That B is not working for me. Okay, what's another B I can try on? Yeah, okay. And so, with that, hopefully it's a B that perhaps focuses on the process, right? Rather than the outcome of like, yeah, I just got last. Maybe it's like, okay, this race, I am going to focus on good tax or getting that first shift, or, maybe 2 to 3 process goals. Along with that, back to breathing, by engaging in that good breathing, right, where we have nice long exhales, right? If we're doing that proactively day to day as part of a breathing practice, again, we're bringing that baseline level of stress and anxiety down so we don't get rattled as much in the first place. And then we're also able to use the skills in the moment to change our physiology. And one of the cool things about breathing too is that not only is there that physiological shift, but by using your breath as a focal point, I mean, your breath, luckily, is one of the most boring things in the world. So if you're focused on your breath, you maybe experience a little bit of boredom, maybe a little bit of intrigue, whatever it is, it's going to be a lighter feeling than I just freaking blew it last race. So I could go on and on about a lot of those topics for a while.
All right, we've got a curiosity question. Hello, Tim. Are you familiar with Daniel Amen is doing with SPECT brain scans? If so, what do you think?
I read a little bit about that. I think I haven't read enough to comment on it. It all sounds really cool. I will say this though, something I have dabbled with myself for about a decade with, actually a bit longer, is neurofeedback, right? So I was talking before about biofeedback. Well, neurofeedback, you can actually put sensors on the scalp and detect EEG brainwave activity and learn to train the kinds of attentional states that you want. So I've been doing it more and more on myself, and it's been life-changing in a lot of ways. And I've been learning it more solidly than ever, so that hopefully I can start weaving it into my practice much more than I used to.
All right, and that was from Paul John. So Paul, if you want to go ahead and drop a couple lines of info about that, we can share it with Tim here, and he can follow up more on that later. And then,
I'm sorry, what was that again, Brittany?
Oh, sorry, I was just saying to Paul John that if he wanted to share more info about it with you, that he can reach out to your contact info here, or drop it in the live chat, and we'll make sure it gets back to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and we've got one more here. You mentioned that our devices can be our window to connecting with other people right now. Do you have thoughts on balancing screen time so the pendulum doesn't swing too far and become a problem through quarantine and whatnot?
Yeah. One, I think do the best you can to connect with the small group that's with you. And if you're stuck alone somewhere, maybe it's that much more important to be using the gizmo. That said, I would say, there are some cool settings on your device where you can actually limit your screen time, right? So maybe limit your screen time on those things, and you can use it to figure out what your patterns are on things like social media, right? I'm not saying no social media, but maybe take a lot of that out with the idea that you're going to substitute whatever time with actually arranging FaceTime calls with people, where you're looking at them, they're looking at you, you're talking about how much it sucks to be cooped up inside, or maybe some of the surprising ways in which it's also wonderful.
All right, and I think that was the last one. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Thanks again for joining us on the Starboard Portal. Tomorrow we have a great Ask Me Anything Q&A with Scott Nixon of Quantum Sales, and he's also going to be talking about the One Design starting process. So make sure to tune in tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. Tim, thanks again for being here. If anybody has further questions, feel free to reach out to his contact info that's on that slide there. and he'll be able to handle any follow-up questions you have.
All right. Thanks so much, Brittany. And thanks, US Sailing.